to tell us how to raise the net zero conversation. Please welcome back Professor Myles Allen.
Thank you, Martin. Well, thank you very much, and well done all of you for braving the rain to come out this evening, and welcome to those online as well. So we're getting on to how we get there, how we're going to achieve net zero, and the importance of raising the conversation is really up to you, because the main point of these lectures this year is we need a much bigger public discussion of how we get to net zero. We've been sort of essentially told, don't worry, the government has it all in hand, until it turns out it doesn't. So we need to actually all engage much more with this if we're going to avoid net zero becoming a very divisive political issue. And I started talking about this in the last lecture, if those of you who were here just before the summer, because we had an election just coming up, and I sort of couldn't resist getting into these topics. But I'll be really focusing on this year, looking at the different climate solutions, different approaches to climate solutions. We won't be going through in detail, how to fit a heat pump. Sorry if to manage your expectations on that. But we will be talking about large-scale approaches to addressing climate change. And that's really what we need the conversation to be about, how we set about achieving net zero. I don't want the conversation to be about whether to bother. I was hearing there's still people out there who require convincing that we need to bother. But I think increasingly we're moving on from that position, and the argument is about how we do it rather than whether. And I'm going to try and explain to you, and this is my view, it's not a view perhaps shared by many others who work in the climate space, that net zero policy is fundamentally different from climate policy. And this is a problem from traditional climate policy. And this is a problem because since we established the need for net zero back in 2009, it's now generally accepted. But the way our government, and indeed most people in the climate policy community, seem to react to this is, well, we need to do traditional climate policy, but just dialed up to 11. We just need to do more of what we thought we were going to do anyway. If you look at the climate policies that people are talking about today, they were all around before we discovered the need for net zero. And I'm going to try and convince you that, in fact, the flagship climate policy, so-called carbon pricing, it's a great policy for getting emissions down, but it's not the policy that's going to get us all the way to net zero. And finally, I'm going to say some provocative things, perhaps, to my economist friends about what it will actually take to get to net zero in terms of policy. But before we get on to the how question, I think it is important to remind ourselves what net zero is for. Because, surprisingly, it's got quite confused in many people's minds and has just become conflated with generally trying very hard at climate, at reducing emissions. That's sort of a lot of, when companies set net zero targets, you actually ask them, well, what do you intend to do? You get a list of things they're going to do, which are just what they were going to do anyway. They're just general climate targets. So net zero is about stopping global warming. It's what it takes to halt global warming. Halt being this sort of careful word that we chose because it's not necessarily going to stop it forever, but it's certainly going to stop it carrying on up for several decades. And so in the left here, I've showed you this. Remember those of you who were here in the year one, we had those plastic tubes to show you how all this worked. Some people are laughing because they can remember that it didn't work very well. So if we reduce emissions, all the net emissions from fossil fuel use and deforestation down to zero, that's the left-hand panel here, then carbon dioxide concentrations will stop rising and start to fall again, crucially, and that will be enough to stabilize global temperatures. And as that carbon dioxide levels are falling, remember that carbon dioxide's not disappearing, it's not turning into anything else. Carbon dioxide's a very stable gas. There's nothing can really react with it. So it's being taken up by the oceans and the biosphere, and that green line below the zero line in the emissions graph shows you right now the fraction of our emissions that's taken up every year by the oceans and biosphere. And fortunately for us, that carries on even after we reach net zero, and that's enough to draw down atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide and stabilize global temperature. We'll come back to that, and that's one of the really important policy discussions that's going on at the moment, the topic of offsetting, this rather nerdy relationship between carbon dioxide and the different sources and sinks of carbon dioxide turns out to be highly relevant to the whole offsetting debate. We talked in the second year, so last year, we talked about why it's a good idea to get on with getting to net zero, having established it's what it takes to stop global warming. When do we have to get there was the topic of last year's lectures. And, again, I just reorganized things a bit to put the temperature response in the middle here. Again, that's the emissions on the right. And if I just sort of change the date at which we get to net zero, that's 2050 is the standard one we aim for. That'll level us out something like just a bit over 1.5 degrees. If I delay for a year, still starting reductions now, but just getting there a little bit slower, we end up a little bit warmer. Just that 10 years slower adds about 1/10 of a degree. And if I just carry on, going later and later, you can see that the temperature goes up. If I delay towards the end of the century, I'm quite likely to end up around 2 degrees. And if I delay past the end of the century, we're going to carry on warming past 2 degrees. On the right, if you were all focusing in, I think it was January's lecture of this year, about the economic harm done by climate change, that purple line is it's an indication, only an indication, of the economic harm done by climate change, expressed as a fraction of global income, global GDP. And the numbers in the vertical, they don't have any significance other than one being how much climate change is costing right now. And so, and I think if you recall that lecture, I was stressing the fact that we can kind of agree on the shape of how the global economy responds to rising temperature, even if we can't agree on the absolute numbers. And the reason, of course, we can't agree on the absolute numbers is because that involves difficult things like, weighing up the value of a pensioner's life versus the value of a 30-year-old's life. Okay? I mean, that sounds like a totally outrageous thing to do, but believe it or not, if you actually want to assign a number to the cost of climate change, you have to make those calls. And you can imagine, so making those calls is very difficult, so very hard to come up with an absolute number for the impact of climate change. But we can say, whatever it is, the impact of climate change today is likely to, so if we sort of limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we'll see the impact of climate change go up to something over double what it is today in terms of economic harm, between 2 and 3 times. And then notice that as I delay and temperatures go up higher, the economic impact goes up ever faster because of that fact that the further you get away from pre-industrial climate, the faster the economic harm from any additional warming accumulates as we cross more and more thresholds and more systems are irreparably harmed. So that's why it's a good idea to get on with it. And the other important thing to remember about net zero, again, what we're not talking about this year, but what hopefully you've brought with you if you've been following these lectures up until now, is because carbon dioxide accumulates in the climate system, delaying getting started is at least twice as bad as taking longer to get there. And the reason for that is, of course, it's back to the braking time analogy. If you hold off hitting the brakes, you've got much less and less time to actually stop. And right now, this is what happens if we had started reductions in 2020. We didn't. If we delay 10 years, that adds, you can see, that adds almost 1/4 degree to the global temperatures we end up at. And if we delay until 2040, starting emission reductions, then even with the same rate of decline, we're then probably going to end up around 2 degrees and 4 times as much damage as damage per year as we're experiencing at the moment. And of course, if we just carry on delaying, off it goes on the top. So we need to get on with it. And therefore, we need a conversation. We need to get people, everybody, on board with this enormous project that we have to address. So we should have started reducing emissions some time ago. That's definitely the case. And until we get on with reducing emissions, the world will continue to warm. Which is why I find this sort of picture rather puzzling. Basically, what these people are saying is, the world's going to warm forever. Celebrate. And they're all very cheerful about that. There are some philosophies for which this would be perfectly coherent. Rumour had it, I've never heard this confirmed, that in the G.W. Bush administration, there were several figures, including Donald Rumsfeld, who were adherents to I can't try to remember the name of it, the theory that basically in 2050, the saved would be taken up to heaven and everybody else would go somewhere else. And if you believe this, of course, it makes their climate policy made perfect sense. Because if that's what's going to happen, then frankly, there's not a lot of point in worrying too much about climate change. And if somebody's telling you that they're not interested in net zero, it's worth sort of drilling down as to why not. Because some people are still, in denial that there's anything happening at all. But many people have moved to the opposite end of the spectrum of thinking, well, it's all hopeless. And that's why they don't like climate policy, because they've just given up. And depressingly, actually, many of the people who've just given up, actually, they're people who were environmentalists, and they've now just sort of given way to despair. I'm absolutely not in that position. People often ask me, do you despair over climate because you sort of keep saying the same thing and nothing's happening? Things are happening. The conversation is evolving. We need more people. We need more people involved in it. More people stepping up and getting interested in how we achieve this. And we need also to help. I do wonder how many people waving around a no to net zero placard realize that they're not waving a no to ULEZ placard. It's sort of these things have become almost interchangeable, and that's the problem. Is that actually, and we're going to come back to this in the corporate net zero, the net zeros for corporations lecture later this year. But when all these corporations signed up for net zero, the environmental movement made an active effort to add more meaning to net zero than the scientists ever intended for it. So net zero means a whole lot of other things now, as well as what we meant. So this is why I wanted to remind you with those graphs of what we meant by net zero, what I mean by net zero, what net zero actually means, because it's had lots of other things added to it, which people don't like. And so then they say, well, I don't like whatever it is that I'm being told net zero means, and therefore I don't like net zero. So, which of course is a bit of nonsense, because actually most of the people in that room probably don't want the world to warm forever. Some of them are quite young. They probably want to stop they would rather the global warming stopped. So that's why that's why we need to have a much more, as I say, open conversation about what to do about it. And remember, even net zero itself was considered quite radical back in 2009 when we came up with it. Because at that time, we'd had 20-odd years where the goal of climate policy was stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And if we go back to that little figure, the dotted line here shows you what happens if we do that, if we reduce emissions just enough to stabilize concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And you can see that doesn't require emissions to fall nearly as far. We only need to reduce them by 80% or so, and provided we carry on reducing them slowly. But we've got many, many decades before we need to get even remotely close to zero. And that would be enough to stabilize concentrations of greenhouse gases, but the world continues to warm. And that was the big finding in 2009, which meant we had to go beyond stabilization to net zero. And countries got this, and they went further within 6 years, just to remind you, to sort of cheer you up. In Paris, 190 countries of the world agreed that they wanted to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century, which, is essentially the countries acknowledging the need for net zero, or at least getting as close as they could agree to acknowledge the need for net zero. Unfortunately, the Paris Agreement isn't completely clear what's included in that removals by sinks. And if you remember, I talked about the fact that carbon dioxide concentrations come down because carbon dioxide is coming back out of the atmosphere and going back into the oceans and the land. And if so this means that there's actually a very large amount of carbon being taken up by Mother Nature that is potentially available to be sold on the offset markets. And this is a huge problem. I'm not going to explain this whole problem now, but I do want to advertise the fact that we are having an entire lecture devoted to the problem of carbon offsetting, because if instead of reducing emissions, we just sort of traded around, particularly if we're trading around carbon that's being taken up naturally anyway, we're never going to actually stop global warming. And this is becoming a huge problem. There's enough vagueness in what the Paris Agreement means by removals by sinks that half the world's emissions could be relabeled net zero without anybody avoiding any emissions at all. So we could all just carry on doing exactly what we're doing, and half of us could claim to have achieved net zero already. So that's this should worry you. It certainly worries me, because many people probably around here in the City of London are happily trading carbon, think they're doing the right thing, they're buying these carbon offsets, they think their company's achieved its net zero goals, and they're achieving absolutely nothing at all. So we need to talk about this. It doesn't mean that no carbon offsetting could ever work, and we will talk about what carbon offsetting needs to mean to actually work, but there are major problems in that industry at the moment. Because at the end of the day, solving climate change, as I frequently reiterate in these lectures, it's not complicated. The lines behind me, if you need to reduce that emission 1 to 0, you need concentrations to come down, that stops the warming. But ever since realizing it was this simple, there's been a sort of lot of efforts at complicating it. And we're going to be talking about one of the institutions or groups of institutions that have done perhaps almost the best job of complicating net zero is the fossil fuel industry, and we're going to be talking about the fossil fuel industry on the 26th of November. That's our next lecture, just before we have another COP in a petrostate in Azerbaijan. It's a good time to be talking about the role of the fossil fuel industry, both in the general confusion around net zero and also in the solutions to it, and the fact that the fossil fuel industry does need to step up. And the way it's going at the moment, it's not only risking the future of the planet, but it's risking the pensions of anybody who's invested in it, which is probably most of us. So they're flailing around rather at the moment. Beyond looking broader, it's not just the fossil fuel industry. The corporate world has done a pretty good job of confusing matters around net zero, and we're going to be talking about claims people make, science-based targets, greenwashing, what I call brown scraping, which is basically, greenwashing is painting your activities green, brown scraping is getting rid of all the rubbish into the bin so that you can say, look, I'm green, but the rubbish is still there. So that's a pretty popular activity among corporates these days. Find a sort of a little entity that nobody's looking too carefully at, stick all the rubbish into that, and then the rest of you looks grand. A couple of corporate types in the audience I know who are nodding sagely at this point, and yeah, you know exactly what I mean. Okay, finally, another complication, which I haven't mentioned at all, which we've barely mentioned throughout these lectures because I've really focused on carbon dioxide. It would be wrong for me to get to the end of a sort of how net zero series of lectures without talking about the other big greenhouse gas, methane. And of course, one of the most prominent, and certainly the one which everybody's heard of, sources of methane is livestock agriculture. So we're going to be talking about methane in general, but specifically on the question of whether net zero means the end of livestock agriculture. I'm not going to give any spoilers on that one, so you'll have to come to that lecture to find out. So net zero is basically pretty simple. Is there an equally simple policy solution? If you ask many people around the world, the solution to climate change is really straightforward, just put a price on carbon. And this has been the mantra from the world's economists and the environmental movement for 30 years or so. And this is indeed the approach to climate policy that I say hasn't changed as a result of net zero. We even heard, despite the fact that it jars somewhat with net zero. And some of the proponents of this sort of approach to climate policy have reacted, and I'm perhaps slightly mean of me, but so Chris Stark, who is actually a very senior role now in government climate policy, was the CEO of the Climate Change Committee until recently. Very much a proponent of this sort of traditional approach to pricing carbon out of the system, is getting very exasperated with the way net zero policy sort of isn't really working with his preferred approach to getting emissions down, and was actually saying in an interview before the summer, well, maybe we should just stop talking about net zero altogether. It's like, no, you should think about why it is that net zero is such an uncomfortable topic of conversation. So that's why we need to have these conversations. So let's talk about pricing carbon, because it is fundamentally a very good idea if what you want to do is get emissions down. So this graph, it's one of many versions of something that I suspect was invented by McKinsey, and it's called a marginal abatement cost curve. And what it shows you is lots of different things you could do to reduce emissions, going from left to right, and arranged in order of more expensive per ton of carbon avoided. So the dark blue ones are to do with transport, the brown sort of beigey coloured ones are to do with power generation, green is agriculture, and so on. So you can see moving from left to right, notice that big sort of chunk of orange in the middle? That's largely where you're replacing fossil fuel power with solar and wind. And that costs a certain amount to do, because solar and wind, under some circumstances, might require more capital than fossil fuel power. At the moment, actually, it's sort of getting fairly marginal as to which one actually costs less. You'll notice there's some little orange wedges even further over, which look even cheaper, even further over to the left. That's where you're sort of replacing coal-fired power stations with gas, for example, which is an even cheaper measure to reduce emissions. But then you sort of run out of things you can do in terms of power generation. You've decarbonized the grid, and then you have to start doing other things. So you've got a grey wedge there, which is sort of, you have to start cutting down on emissions in industry and so on. And we keep going through further and further over to the right, and then we get and it gets more and more expensive to get rid of the next slug of emissions. But crucially, there's a lot of emissions that are relatively cheap to avoid. So the general consensus is that for less than £100 per ton of carbon, which is, I'll show you in a minute, less than many of the sort of carbon prices we effectively pay already, we could actually halve global emissions. And so, if what you want to do is halve global emissions, then sticking a price on carbon, a relatively modest price, £100 per ton, that's mental arithmetic here, but 20 pence per litre of petrol, sort of annoying but tolerable, sort of, if it was phased in over time, that would be enough to halve global emissions. And it's a nice, simple, easy to understand policy, which is why it's been so much the sort of center of climate policy for decades. And of course, there's the right-hand end of this graph that we need to talk about, and don't worry, we will come back to it. And there is evidence that carbon pricing does work. A paper published only a few weeks ago, actually, a group of econometricians and others looked at lots of data over the world at the time that different policies were introduced, and using very elaborate statistical methods to work out if they'd had any impact on actual emissions. And so I just pulled out the UK example here because it's sort of more familiar to us, but you can go to the paper and see lots and lots of different countries. And you can see this is UK emissions from electricity generation alone. And if you look in the bottom, all those little coloured dots, those show where different policies were introduced over the past couple of decades that were targeting reducing UK electricity emissions. So you can see electricity emissions were coming down anyway, coming up to 2010, but then we had a whole bunch of climate policies were introduced around 2010, and most of those were around putting an extra price on high carbon sources of electricity. So we had an emission trading scheme introduced, which meant that companies emitting large amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had to pay for it, or buy certificates from other companies. So that was effectively a carbon price was introduced. We had a renewable feed-in tariff, which again was sort of the other side of a carbon price. You can either price carbon or you can subsidize non-carbon, and economically it sort of works the same way. And the only thing which wasn't a carbon price around that time was there was an announced ban on, I think it was building new coal-fired power stations. So largely through implementing these carbon price-based policies, we pushed UK emissions down further than they would have gone anyway. That you can see from the red line's sort of what would have happened without these policies, and the blue and black is what actually happened. And you can see that, emissions were coming down anyway, but, the policies definitely had an impact, or at least, as good as the evidence is that we can have, the policies did have an impact. So I absolutely wouldn't want to tell you that conventional climate policies don't work. They absolutely do work to drive emissions down. And remember, these were relatively modest carbon prices we were talking about back then. It was the ETS price, the emission trading scheme price was sort of wobbling around 20, 30 pounds per tonne, which is actually really low compared to many other carbon prices that are out there in the world. In fact, one of the sort of reasons climate policy sort of isn't really working very well at the moment is an enormous variation in carbon prices across different parts of the economy. This is a slightly out-of-date figure. I couldn't find an up-to-date one, but I'm sure it exists if you look for it. But this is from Catapult Energy Systems back in 2018. They just looked at the range of carbon prices people were paying in different parts of the economy, and the size of the blob indicates the amount of emissions in that activity. And you can see that for some activities we are effectively imposing a carbon price of hundreds of pounds per tonne, and this is essentially what the government is paying to get emissions down per tonne of CO2 avoided in that sector. So sort of electrification of rail, if it were done purely as a climate measure, is extremely expensive as a way of getting down emissions. Now, that's a big if, and of course there's all sorts of reasons we want to electrify rail, and so that's why looking at it as just a price on carbon is probably not a great way of addressing this. But nevertheless, it does give you an indication of where the low-hanging fruit are. And the idea, the point of this report and of many others like it is, we're working really hard to reduce some emissions when there's actually much more somewhere else in the economy we could actually make much more progress on. And so, for a given amount of money, we're not really spending it very efficiently if we have this huge range of effective carbon prices in the economy. So, the economists are almost certainly right. If you want to, they are right, that if we wanted to find the most cost-effective way of reducing emissions, the right answer would definitely be an economy-wide carbon price. So is this the solution? Do we just need an economy-wide carbon price and just raise it to solve the problem? Is this the solution? We just need higher carbon prices. Let me remind you what the net carbon price is. It's not necessarily a tax. It could be it's the net impact of the policies you've got, on the one hand, to penalize carbon dioxide generating activities, or other greenhouse gas generating activities as well, but we're focused on carbon dioxide here. So things like an emission trading system, which we've had for many years, carbon taxes, fuel duties, and so on. And any policy that's introduced explicitly to make it more expensive to generate carbon dioxide. And in addition to that, you have to add on subsidies for non-CO2 generating alternatives. So that's sort of another, economists will argue about this, whether the subsidies should be included in the carbon price. But if we're sort of among friends, we can kind of bundle all these things together. Because essentially they have the same thing. They have the same effect. You can either subsidize the renewables, or you can penalize the fossil source of energy, and you change the economic logic of which one to use, and that's how you drive down emissions. So both of these, and so there's kind of subsidies, which we're also pretty fond of in the UK, things like feed-in tariffs and contracts for difference, where the government sort of guarantees the price of energy from institutions like wind farms and so on. Subsidies have really taken off recently with the extraordinary Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which actually is pumping money into the green transition at an extraordinary rate. And hats off to the Americans for doing this. It's having a huge impact. I often comment there's very few pieces of legislation that you'll be able to see in the geological record. That's one of them. So the ambition of the Inflation Reduction Act is extraordinary, but it's entirely based on subsidies. And I think various economists blanch slightly as to what is going to happen in the long term if you're sort of trying to solve a problem on this scale by hosing public money at it. And crucially, neither of these things is very popular. Here are some pensioners in Australia who've just thrown out the Australian government. This was back in 2016, 17, I can't remember exactly when. The Gillard government in Australia bravely introduced a rather small carbon tax. They promptly lost the election and frightened everybody in Australia from talking about carbon taxes for about a decade. And even here, on the subsidies side, we see still plenty of invective from the likes of Matt Ridley, who, by the way, I know, and he's a nice, friendly chap, but you wouldn't have guessed it from the tone of this headline. But madness of our worship of wind, and talking about the amount of money we're spending on wind, which Matt Ridley really doesn't like. The problem is that even the kind of subsidies we're providing at the moment, and the kind of carbon prices we're imposing at the moment, which are at the sort of relatively modest level, it's already getting people wound up. And what really scares me is the right-hand side of this graph. How high will carbon prices actually need to go if we're going to use that approach to squeeze carbon out of the economy entirely? And you can see, $100 a ton would get us halfway, but what's going to get us all the way? In fact, this sort of mysterious grey wedge here, which sort of fuzzes out, that's what the authors of this report said, non-abatable, meaning you'd need effectively an infinite carbon price to drive out those activities from the economy. So you have basically no option but to ban those activities entirely. And that's where you can see net zero policy really running up against the buffers, because this is where it's going to get, this is where it's potentially going to get ugly. Because if we look at the scenarios for what it takes to get to net zero, we're talking very high carbon prices indeed. This is a graph, a sort of spaghetti diagram of carbon prices in lots and lots of scenarios from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which achieve different levels of peak warming. So that just focus on the light blue and dark blue ones. Those are sort of 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios. And you can see, yes, it's a big spaghetti, but many of them, it's a logarithmic scale in the vertical, and many of these scenarios, particularly the ones that limit warming to close to 1.5 degrees, they're talking like £1,000 per tonne of CO2 by mid-century. And if we unpack these in more detail, and this is a rather sort of nerdy plot, but it does sort of show the strength of the evidence for this point. This is gathering all of these scenarios together. The grey circles indicate different assumptions about the future of society and the world economy, and the colours indicate levels of climate ambition, so levels of, so blue is we really try hard to limit warming, and red is we really don't bother, dark red. And so you can see all of these scenarios, they follow a very clear pattern, which is the higher the carbon price in 2050, the lower emissions, but you can also draw a pretty much straight line through any one of these families of scenarios, and you find that those lines intersect zero in 2050 at around $1,000 per tonne of CO2. So it's a very consistent message coming through from all of these scenarios. If you want to get to net zero, you're talking that sort of money. $1,000 per tonne of CO2 is probably slightly mind-boggling. So let's essentially talk about what this means. Julian Allwood at Cambridge has given us a vision for the future of an absolute zero Britain in a report published in 2019. I think he's still, again, it's been around for a few years now, but I think many people would still say this is the kind of thing we need to address. I don't know if you can read all of the words on this. I was just showing you but these are sort of the changes they imagined that would have to happen to get to squeeze CO2 emissions out of the UK economy entirely, using, and the sort of the thought exercise that they set themselves was using only existing technologies in 2019, and in particular, they were very suspicious of any technology that involved disposing of carbon dioxide, so carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and disposal. And so they assume if we don't have those available, then the only way of getting the UK to net zero is to get the UK to absolute zero, meaning there's no net at all. You've just got to stop using fossil fuels entirely. So what does that mean? Well, for certain activities, it means quite a lot, because, again, the report's authors reckon that on the time scale of the report, we wouldn't have aeroplanes that don't require kerosene, and therefore we're going to sort of close all our airports. They allowed Heathrow, Gatwick and Glasgow. Heathrow, Heathrow, Glasgow and Belfast get to stay. Everything else moves onto rail. And then in the 2040s, we phase out aviation entirely. For shipping, because at the moment we don't have proven technologies for fossil-free shipping that would be deployable on that timescale. We have to stop shipping, and all food would have to come in through the Channel Tunnel. Are technologies appearing which would mean this wouldn't be true? Maybe, but we can't sort of necessarily guarantee that they will. That's the trouble, because they're all quite nascent technology. Ships, there are test ships that are run on ammonia, for example, but they're very much. I think there's one vessel out there which is burning ammonia. Heating powered down, so we'd have to manage on going back to, as people frequently point out, back to the temperature that rooms are typically heated at in the 1970s, which was significantly colder than it is today, and yet, but how would that go? I mean, again, you've got to sort of imagine how this is going to go with the voters as we go through. Further down the list, we've got beef and lamb phased out. We'll come on to that in the livestock lecture. And essentially, the bottom line on this is a complete phase-out scenario for fossil fuels. We phase out fossil fuels from the UK economy entirely. You'll notice that after the no-entry signs, so to speak, we see certain activities growing again, and if you just see over on the right here, you'll notice lots of these activities that sort of can establish themselves again after 2050 involve carbon capture and storage. This is so essentially the assumption that Julian Allwood and his colleagues made was that we wouldn't actually develop carbon capture and storage until the mid-century. It wouldn't be available at scale, and so we just have to go through this rather difficult period in the middle of the century where we just have to do without a lot of stuff, and then after that we'd be able to start using fossil fuels again with carbon capture and storage in order to get available to get rid of the CO2. And so that's and it's a perfectly reasonable account of what would happen if you tried to eliminate fossil fuels completely from the UK economy and then only allow them to creep back in when carbon capture and storage was available, and as they assumed that carbon capture and storage would not be available for at least 20 or 30 years. I find this vision very difficult to imagine happening, and I think that overwhelmingly that you can imagine the public conversation about net zero, if that's what, we haven't seen nothing yet, if this is the future that net zero has in store. So we will, by the way, be talking about other scenarios. For example, if one of the, obviously any scenario is a series of assumptions about the future. Both the integrated assessment model from the IPCC, that spaghetti diagram of colored lines, and Julian Allwood's report make assumptions about future prices of renewable energy and our ability to synthesize fuels from thin air and that sort of thing, that might turn out to be wrong. So we might come up with an unlimited source of carbon-free energy in the 2030s, which would, of course, change this whole the whole perspective. I mean, they might crack fusion tomorrow. Well, maybe not tomorrow, but but not just fusion. Conventional renewable energy sources might get so cheap, and our ability to sort of synthesize fuels from thin air might get so efficient that none of these choices need to get made, and that we can actually just phase out fossil fuels painlessly. There's a growing body in the academic community who sort of argues strongly, including some of my colleagues in Oxford, that this is actually what's going to happen, that actually achieving net zero will be completely painless because it'll be cheaper to use renewables than it will be in all parts of the economy than to use fossil fuels at all. So people will just sort of stop using fossil fuels on their own accord. We'll come back to this when we talk about the role of the fossil fuel industry and alternatives to it in the next lecture. But I think we have to acknowledge the possibility that this very, very optimistic scenario for the future may turn out to be wrong. I'm not saying it's going to be wrong, but we just got to let's not bank on it. It seems a rather Pollyanna-ish view for us to assume that's what can happen. Which is why, and I must get onto this because this is like from last week, and I feel very strongly about it. This sort of thing is so dangerous. So we saw in The Guardian last week, reported a letter from colleagues, many of whom I know, writing to the Secretary of State in Miliband, asking for him to pause, yet again, the initial rollout of carbon capture in the UK. A decision needs to be made by our government around now. They were going to make it in September. They haven't said anything, so... we live in hope, on whether or not to go ahead with the so-called Track 1 clusters for putting carbon dioxide back under the North Sea. And these, actually the Guardian headlined it Climate Scientists. It was actually a collection of scientists and renewable energy advocates and activists that were writing to say they should pause, and I say yet again because we've been here before we were about to become world leaders in carbon capture and storage, carbon dioxide disposal back in 2011, and then the government pulled the plug at the last minute after industry had invested tens of millions of pounds in the projects they were talking about. Same thing happened in 2015. There, the government, they slipped the announcement out just at the beginning of the meeting for the Paris Agreement, so nobody noticed, or they hoped nobody would notice. And largely, they succeeded. Nobody did notice. I mean, I noticed. I was very sad, but nobody else seemed to care very, very much. And so if they did it again for a third time, that would almost certainly be it for efforts to get rid of carbon dioxide on any scale in the UK economy. And this is dangerous because if we just look at what's required, and we're going to come back to this figure in later lectures, what the Climate Change Committee reckons we need to do to get to net zero in the UK, a lot of it doesn't require carbon capture, but a big chunk of it does. And if you eliminate carbon capture, if you take it off the table, you definitely increase the incentive to invest in renewables and demand reduction, in the sense that back in the First World War, they sent pilots up in balsa wood aircraft without parachutes so as to focus their minds on the fight. This is true. And it's a little bit like that. It's like, don't give them a parachute and they'll work harder. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what's going to happen, because I think taking this off the table when this is the technology we need to get us that last mile to actually achieve net zero makes it far more likely that climate policy fails altogether. Since I've got your attention, though, I can't resist saying, £1 billion, which is what we're arguing over here, that's the subsidy that the previous government promised these Track 1 projects to get them going. It's quite a lot of taxpayers' money, and at a time when the government's just sort of cancelled winter fuel payments to pensioners, handing a cheque for £1 billion essentially to the oil and gas industry is going to be tricky. You can see why it's a vulnerable decision at the moment. So if anybody's listening, we do need to ask ourselves, is that really the way to do this? Who really benefits from a successful rollout of carbon capture? Well, obviously our grandchildren do, because we stop global warming, but in addition, suppliers and users of fossil fuels definitely benefit. And this, of course, is why, because of course it means they can carry on selling their products for a little bit longer than they would be able to do so otherwise. And this, of course, is why so many in the environmental movement really hate this technology, because it might mean that life is not quite as difficult for the fossil fuel industry as they feel it should be. So why not fund the $1 billion with a little tiny levy on all fossil fuels entering the UK economy, both domestic productions and imports? And £1 billion over 3 years is less than £1 per tonne of CO2. Remember those carbon prices I was talking about? They're already up at sort of 25, 50 pounds per tonne of CO2. This would be invisible. Very easy to do. We know exactly who's bringing carbon into the UK economy. They're all taxed already. £1 per tonne. You've solved the problem. You've got your $1 billion, and you don't have to explain to the pensioners why you didn't give them the money and you gave it to an oil and gas company instead. That's less than half a penny per litre of petrol, so its impact on consumer prices would be invisible. I'm not the first to have had this idea. Well, we might argue about this because I've actually been going on about this for a while, but Chris Skidmore, in his first public document, which actually proposed this in the Mission Zero review, government should consider setting fossil fuel producers operating domestically a storage obligation target. We're going to come back to this idea, but basically make the industry pay for it, rather than paying for it out of taxpayers, out of the pocket of taxpayers. We'll be coming back to this idea of making the industry pay. By the way, looking ahead, the European Union actually has, for the first time, introduced an obligation on the fossil fuel industry to actually start building capacity for carbon dioxide storage. So the first time actually anybody's actually required the fossil fuel industry to do anything about fixing the consequences of the product itself, which I think is truly historic. And remarkably, it was lobbied hard against by the fossil fuel industry, and they lost. That doesn't happen very often. So hats off to the European Commission for standing its ground on that one. And we're going to be coming back to this in the final lecture of this series, where we talk about the concept of carbon take-back and how, in my view, at least, we will stop fossil fuels from causing global warming eventually, having exhausted all the alternatives. So net zero needs new climate policies. We can't just carry on by exactly the same policies, just dialed up to 11. We need, starting down the road to net zero, is a socio-economic challenge. If you price carbon, you just adjust the economy to move away from high carbon sources of energy towards low carbon sources of energy. That's an efficient way of doing it. You know, the economists have got that one nailed. They know what they're doing to start emissions. But getting there, getting all the way to net zero, is primarily an engineering challenge. We need to build a capacity to get rid of carbon dioxide, to capture it either where it's generated or back out of the atmosphere and stick it permanently back underground. To put it this way, climate policy needs an exit strategy. It's all very well, and this was a phrase, actually, I confess I came up with back in 2009 when everybody was fretting about exit strategies from Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was like, it's kind of quite easy to get into climate policy, to start reducing emissions. But you won't bring people with you unless you can tell them the whole story, and that it's not just going to be ever-increasing pain going forward into the future. We need to be able to tell people the whole the full story of how our climate policy is going to succeed. And I believe it. So we actually used this in the title of a commentary, which I believe, looking back, may have actually been the first publication in the world to actually use the phrase net zero. Although, well, we said zero net emissions. We didn't actually say net zero emissions, but I'll take it. It's pretty close. And where we pointed out that in the end, it was the policies required to dispose of carbon dioxide that are going to make the difference between halting global warming and not. And it's that interplay between the policies we have now and the policies we need in the future to get us all the way to net zero, which are going to be the topic of this year's Gresham lectures. So please come to the other ones where we get into much more detail on how these work, but I hope that's given you an overview of the challenge ahead of us. Thank you.